Welcome to Establishing Setting, Walking Around in the World You Are Creating, a video presentation of the 2018 Rave Reviews Book Club 3rd Annual Writers Conference and Book Expo. I'm your how-to maven, producer and presenter, Stephen Gies. Now, most authors establish setting by default. They imagine a story and see it that way while they write. Still, setting is critical to immersing readers in your scenes, so it should never be left to chance. Most good stories can be told in different settings, so we must consider our options and carefully make the best choices, not just to help the plot unfold, but to provide variety, visual and sensory interest, and even mystery or intrigue. While we won't have time today to explore many of the advanced techniques for finessing setting, I'm confident even savvy storytellers will at least find some new ways to think about planning their projects. You want to invite us into your worlds, and that starts with you walking around in them yourself. Stories occur in a setting, the primary elements of which are location and time. Most long tales break into scenes that occur in different areas within an overall location. Nearly all cover a span of time, which might range from a few hours to many millennia. Some alternate between multiple locations and/or back and forth in time. Authors must consider many factors when choosing the best options for their story settings, locations, and times. So let's talk about locations. Setting locations, which include props, may be very specific, or they may be general, approximate, or vague. They may take place in a setting that is fictional within a real context, entirely fictional though familiar, or fully in the realm of fantasy. An example of a specific location in the Western genre is the town of Tombstone, precisely as it existed during the period when the story takes place. A general location might be an unspecified small town on a stagecoach route in a recognizable Western USA territory during the same period, with reasonable accuracy regarding the setting elements, buildings, communications, transportation, clothing, etc., to make it seem real. An approximate location might be any small Western town during that period, without specifying the region or state, yet still containing believable elements. A vague location might incorporate only some familiar elements that evoke the location: a saloon, cattle herded down the street, a blacksmith shop, without anything more specific, which means it might well be somewhere outside the USA, such as the Outback, another planet, or a starship holodeck. A fictional within real location skews toward a specific place, such as Tombstone in 1893, but contains fictionalized elements. These may range from could-be reality, such as an unusual saloon that history does not show existed, or fantastical elements, such as a time machine concealed in the local livery. A fictional though familiar location might be a town that never existed in a place where people never lived, but otherwise as authentic as possible about familiar elements. And finally, a fantasy location offers limitless possibilities, from alien worlds to alternate universes. Fantasy locations nearly always incorporate at least a few elements that are somewhat familiar to readers in order to provide frames of reference, but those might range from the very familiar, such as an otherwise typical small town in Iowa where everyone has special powers and trees are sentient, to the wildly unfamiliar settings of realms that might even violate the commonly accepted laws of physics. Now let's look at times. Setting times may vary as much as their locations. Specific time can offer actual dates, past, present, or future, or other identifiers that fixed frames of reference, whether short-term or covering a long period, or even jumping around to various specific times. For example, the day of President Lincoln's assassination, or the night RMS Titanic sank, are very specific. General time offers a narrow but otherwise non-specific period, such as the first year of the California Gold Rush. Approximate time focuses less clearly on the period or periods without being specific, such as the Civil War, or 1890s Arizona territory. Now, vague time evokes a period without specifics, such as the era of the Wild West, the Space Age, or antebellum. Fictional within real time tends to include elements that are incongruous. Allowing real historical characters to possess inventions and/or capabilities that we know to be out of place for the era is a popular example of this kind of time setting. Another is placing a real person in a specific time he did not live, or a fictional character in a real time. Fictional but familiar time may work the same way, but less specifically, such as using characters and/or capabilities that seem real but are not historically accurate for a general or approximate time. Alternate universe and alternate history stories rely on this element, such as depicting a setting where Hitler did succeed in his quest for domination, or where a lack of fossil fuels means we never developed our common power sources and modes of transportation. Now, fantasy time is limitless in the range of past through future, as well as alternate realities. Time itself might even be subject to manipulation in fantasy time settings, such as the ability to move back and forth through it, altering or bending or slowing or speeding its passage, or even setting your story in a world in which time runs backwards. Understand the difference. Telling a story's plot backwards is not the same as telling one in which time itself literally runs backwards. As you determine your story's setting, keep in mind that all location and time elements fall somewhere in the range between what readers do and do not see or know. You might choose very specific times and locations, but not reveal those until later in the story, if at all. You might never present specifics, but tell your story in a way that readers will draw their own conclusions, even if this results in different interpretations from reader to reader. Likewise, you will be making many decisions, not only about what elements to incorporate in your setting, but to what extent you describe them and how much you rely on readers to default to their assumptions. Default. So default settings is the first thing that we always have to consider. Now let's talk about default settings, which are way more important than a lot of writers think. Like an intuitive search engine, readers constantly take bits of information from your prose and fill in the blank areas with default assumptions. This is a handy process writers can rely on when they artfully anticipate which cues will spark the most accurate and complete fill-ins. Handled poorly by the writer, descriptions of setting can lead to wrong assumptions that later confuse or even annoy readers who must constantly correct their mental images with incongruous new details as they emerge. One of the greatest challenges is for a writer to depict settings which are in many ways familiar, but also include elements that contradict common assumptions. Skillful setting description in these situations requires anticipating reader assumptions so they can be overcome before correction becomes necessary. Now, when I teach this topic to a group, I like to describe a brief scenario that includes elements of setting and action, but which are sufficiently vague as to leave room for listeners to assume overmuch. Including misleading cues will inevitably lead the audience to form images that can be easily contradicted. For example, elements might include a large herd seen through the window grazing to the east, or stopping to rifle through papers on the desk, or suiting up for the big presentation. Now, unless and until the scenario is retold with more specific information, the group likely will picture a herd of cattle rather than llamas, or rifling through business-oriented paperwork on an office-style desk rather than newspapers on a concierge desk, and a business suit for a PowerPoint presentation rather than wetsuit and scuba gear to show the marine park's owners new dolphin tricks. Notice too that those minimal corrections I just made just sparked new sets of assumptions regarding the settings. The audience would have to continue readjusting upon learning they are wild mutant llamas that have claimed the fields around Chernobyl, or that it's a black language newspaper for an incoming Blackian delegation soon to pass the spaceport's concierge desk, and a demonstration that will show off the new lingual capabilities of dolphins with surgically implanted voice modulators. do use assumption-sparking cues for quickly communicating key elements of your setting, especially visual cues such as buildings and clothing and weather, and interactive elements such as transportation vehicles and communication devices and entertainment modes. When assumptions will aid your setting description, favor elements that encourage default, such as opening with the stagecoach stopping in front of a blacksmith shop. When assumptions will more likely contradict your vision, favor elements that urge readers to suspend or delay filling in blanks as they wait for more information, such as having the hover coach suddenly appear in the air above the flowing fluid spires of the Wooga Smith shop. Now, default assumptions play important roles in story planning long before the process of describing the setting or settings for readers. In stories where the setting provides minimal backdrop with very little role in the plot, reliance on default assumptions helps avoid slowing pace with distracting description. In stories where the elements of setting will influence plot and character, defaults must be carefully refuted to avoid slowing pace with confusion and correction. In stories where setting elements will provide surprise benefits to key characters, such as when they need to climb to a cliffside cave to escape a flash flood, the setting description must simultaneously anticipate and refute defaults while adding disguised description sufficient to avoid telegraphing upcoming plot. For example, sending your characters along a series of cliffside trails likely will not evoke images of caves, but if you present a setting riddled with fissures and cracks, gnarled trees growing from crevices, occasional cave-ins, and a few musty caves with bats flying in and out, then readers will have no trouble fitting a flood-fleeing race to an upper cave into their mental images of the setting. Default assumptions might also be designed to foreshadow, such as having characters notice age-old flood marks on the rocks reaching to just below the cave entrance. While it is laudable to keep description to a minimum, lazy writing that avoids description because the author is simply picturing his own default setting or settings risks alienating that diversity of readers who envision the scene their ways. Many good writers find greater satisfaction in avoiding default-styled settings in lieu of creating richly textured scenes that are unique and thus creatively engage the readers. Still, genre writing offers a long tradition with loyal readers who seek out stories in common settings, such as westerns, gritty urban potboilers, Regency romances, legal or medical thrillers, and modern-day zombie fests. Others take classic genre elements and change or combine settings to bring new life to familiar themes, such as the transition from Transylvania-style vampire tales to contemporary suburban teenage vampire romances. So let's talk about default assumption manipulation. It offers a fast and easy setting description, but providing greater detail, unique elements, and variation from setting to setting presents challenges to writers who want readers to envision accurately without bogging down in lengthy description. To accomplish this, writers must develop settings in tandem with plot during the planning stages. It is possible to develop a plot that could occur in any number of different settings, such as a coming-of-age tale of betrayal leading to a life lesson on friendship and loyalty that could be told in an inner-city housing project just as well as a rural, hill country holler. However, once you make specific setting choices, they will bring with them new possibilities for affecting plot. For example, teenage young adult romances between culturally different lovers have played out in settings as diverse as West Side Story and Romeo and Juliet. But when you choose to create a setting in which vampires secretly live among the teens, new obstacles and complications become possible. So set description pacing, something that you have to think about throughout the whole writing process. When plot elements depend on choices arising from the setting, pacing the description must depend on how setting will be used in the plot. For example, a teenage vampire romance might benefit from early plot points designed to reveal the secret world of normal-seeming vampires, while a different version might benefit from plot designed to trick readers into defaulting to a normal setting until we are surprised by the revelation that vampires exist. Anticipating which scenes will feature fast-moving plot developments helps savvy writers plan to depict setting in advance so they can avoid slowing the pace at inopportune times. When the flash flood sweeps our characters into the canyon, oh no, readers should already picture the trails and fissures and gnarly trees and high-up caves, so the fast-paced action draws their attention. Slowing the plot to describe setting during fast action can ruin the story's pacing almost as grievously as amateurish reliance on exposition. The playwright's reliance on setting the stage applies to some extent in all forms of storytelling. Readers need to start the story or new scene locations with something fairly specific to picture, a setting carefully described at least to manipulate, even circumvent the process of defaulting. However, writers often err in assuming they must grind out detailed setting descriptions right away so readers can picture the whole stage. Ideally, setting description will be spaced out to facilitate vision only where and when it is needed. Readers are forgiving about lack of setting details if their attention is already engaged by action, tension, or even a journey through character interior. Character point of view, POV, helps the writer choose where to focus attention and when to describe whatever the POV character is aware of. Opening with 2 paragraphs depicting the entire warehouse interior, then focusing on our POV character hanging one-handed from a slippery cable over spinning grinder blades, violates POV because the character is not focusing on 2 paragraphs worth of warehouse details. Good setting description can focus where the character's attention goes, on the cable, the grinder, a nearby railing he might swing toward, and so on. We can see the rest of the warehouse, at least the parts that matter, when he escapes and begins to move through it, maybe to avoid detection, which would bring in other setting elements such as listening through the machine din for sounds of pursuers, or sniffing for the odor of gas if he worries they might burn him out. Even when you need to grind out large amounts of setting description at once, POV helps you pace it by injecting the character's impressions and interpretations. Rather than describing the entire warehouse interior as if painting a neutral picture, you can have your POV character survey and evaluate all the interior elements for signs of danger, possible routes of escape, potential materials for fashioning weapons or traps, and so on. Thus, you will have effectively used the interaction between plot and setting. Now we can see that warehouse, and you never stop the action to tell us what it looks like. So let's talk about set variety. Most stories play out in multiple related settings. For example, a Western might include scenes of traveling the trail, being caught in a flood, fighting in a saloon, tracking a bear, and whatever is transpiring back at the ranch. In rare cases, a story might take place substantially or entirely in a single, unvarying setting, such as being trapped in a buried coffin, negotiating a maze, surviving in a lifeboat, or conversing in a fast food booth. Still, plot with a variety of settings tends to hold reader interest better. Test your scene locations against even the wildest alternatives you might conjure. Often your first assumptions will prove less interesting, especially if they're the same places you've been using. Playwrights and screenwriters of low-budget productions are restricted in the number and complexity of locations at their disposal, often finding themselves needing to squeeze plot into only a few places that can be used many times, or at least for large portions of the story. Now, a novelist, however, is limited only by his imagination and his ability to create settings that readers can understand. If your outline calls for 5 different important conversations back at the ranch, at minimum you should be able to have one in the parlor, another in the barn, another while watching a young colt being trained in the corral, and so on. Better yet, you might be able to move some of those conversations away from the ranch, such as while both characters are hurrying out on horseback to round up an escaped steer. Then you can create exciting action in a new setting, and you may enhance the plot-driving dialogue with colorful debate over how best to capture it, which can reveal character. It can add poignancy and even add symbolism and metaphor, all of which lead to ideas for improving your plot. Avoid running scenes of the same or similar locations back to back. Slower-paced, visually bland, or dialogue-heavy scenes should never occur in sequence with each other, especially in the same setting, if you can intersperse faster, action-based, visually interesting scenes. One technique is to divide scenes into smaller pieces and alternate the shorter segments while they overlap each other in time. For example, 10 pages of preparations at the ranch for what to do if the search party doesn't return, followed by 10 more pages of them trying to survive the flood, that can be split into short alternating scenes. That keeps even an action scene like the flood from feeling static, while the cutaways to another setting help readers feel rising tension in waves. With finesse, this method can even alternate between different periods of time. Vary your settings to enhance or relieve readers' emotions. Readers can grow weary during long, intense scenes, so cutaways can help them breathe. Consider one character sitting all night in the bedroom with a grief-stricken friend as they discover acceptance. Enhance that emotional arc with setting, such as moving them over by the window or out to the veranda, where sunrise can be timed to bring light to their darkness. Spectacular colors, blooming flowers along the railing, silhouettes of birds soaring in the distance. Setting can illustrate the survivor's changing frame of mind, or, if presented in the other character's point of view, it can urge readers to feel symbolic hope, even if the survivor does not notice the sunrise and/or feel the hope. Setting variety can be used to preset faster scenes. If you have parts of scenes, especially dialogue, that can move or split up, think of climax scenes ahead and set something there earlier. If you intend their peril in a river flood later, maybe they talk about that time they had to save someone in that very spot as they herd cattle across the river in an earlier scene. Then you can establish many of the important setting elements in advance, so later you can describe action faster, yet still count on us to picture the scene. One of the most important tricks that you can use for setting is to build tension. Your choice of setting can alter the amount of tension automatically built into the scene. Adding the right props can do that too. Consider location danger. These are dangerous elements in the setting, even if they do not appear to be imminent threats. Examples include heights and precipices, harsh weather, dangerous animals, nefarious people, bad neighborhoods, distance from safe haven, and obstacles to safety. Now, dangerous props include the presence of weapons, environmental hazards, a slippery floor, broken glass, torn mosquito netting, and others can ramp up tension in your point of view character's mind, which readers then feel. Now, set mystery can even enhance reader tension while the POV character doesn't recognize it. This can make readers want to shout warning or shake some sense into the character. What's in the suspicious package? What made that noise? Is somebody in the closet? Is it hot in here? Be careful not to violate POV conventions, though, by making sure your character is aware of what we sense, even if not interpreting it the way we do. Obstacle setting can add to or even be the source of your main character's goal. Setting can add struggling to survive cold or heat, weather, lack of food, a leaky or fuel-starved vehicle, being lost, losing communication, being trapped, having hostiles nearby, being controlled by others, and more. Contrast setting uses a location to enhance the feel of another location, such as grossly uncomfortable situations contrasted with plot that can happen in luxury. It can enhance the traits of character, such as fish out of water tales. Crocodile Dundee in New York City creates myriad plot possibilities, which can add complications or humor or tension to the character-based story you planned for his own environment. Take Dorothy out of Kansas. Character setting is putting your POV character among others who are pointedly similar or who are quite different. That one restless nun in the convent must struggle with fitting in or not, while Ishmael's ignorance of whalers and their lifestyles enhances both him and them. Obvious choices include others as zombies or aliens. Putting a novice cop in the car with an old-school rule breaker shows their roles very differently. You could show us the adult world from the setting and mind of a child. People are products of and shapers of their environments, so make sure you create places where your characters fit. Layered setting allows your characters to change how they see their world. That campus can be a safe place to learn and discover others until it becomes too dangerous to walk through at night. and the school is a front for a secret organization, and so on. Let your character discover what really happens in a substandard food processing plant, or a crooked law firm, or the fashion industry. Use setting to shatter assumptions, and you will discover exciting story possibilities. Symbolic setting can work on many levels. You can work with props that have symbolic meaning, locations that add meaning, or even the entire plot as symbol. Using his own life experiences, Mark Twain made Huck Finn's journey down a river and subsequent return home symbolic of his journey back to his true morality, with each adventure along the way symbolic in its own way. A desert needs crossing and surviving. Mountains need scaling or escaping. Factories feature workers as cogs in a machine. Jungles represent the unknown, the unexplored. Seas feature mysteries below, and they are fluid, shifting, weather-blown, angry. So let's consider fantasy versus real settings. Some stories require complete fantasy worlds, except that most feature familiar elements. You can create a world from scratch, such as Lord of the Rings, or you can make it coexist with ours, such as Avatar or Tron. You can create fantasy elements that overlap the real world, but allow your story to play largely within the fantasy setting, such as the Harry Potter books. You can create fantasy elements in the real world, such as Spider-Man. Whether your settings are all or part fantasy, fictionalized places in the real world, or intended to occur in real places readers will know, verisimilitude and consistency are essential. Fantasy elements must have logic, which must be established in advance of their effect on plot. Otherwise, stories feel contrived. When you use real settings, expect some readers to be intimately familiar, not only with the place, but with how the people there think and behave. Research if you don't know, and even if you think you do. Be careful of your assumptions about places and situations and periods of time you've not directly experienced. Never rely on how other stories depict settings, as they might be poorly researched or be taking liberties. Sure, some stories expect us to suspend disbelief, but most readers prefer sufficient verisimilitude to engage their emotions without shattering the illusion. Never underestimate the importance of setting to make it all feel real, even when it's especially not. So plan setting. The where and the when of your plot might seem obvious to you at first, but your story will benefit if you consider your options carefully. Then render your settings in the right amount of vivid detail. Encourage us to use all our senses in a fully drawn environment, especially where we can visualize your exquisite imagery. Picture your story made into a movie and create a vision that would cost the producers a sizable budget. For the 2018 Rave Reviews Book Club 3rd Annual Writers Conference and Book Expo, I'm Stephen Gies. I very much appreciate your feedback. Please remember to spread the word about Rave Reviews Book Club.